Karoline Leavitt silences Stephen Colbert live on TV. You won't believe what happened. On The Late Show, while Colbert tried to keep things lighthearted, Karoline shut him down with sharp questions about sensitive social issues. Her bold statements completely changed the conversation, forcing Colbert and the audience to face uncomfortable truths. Don't miss this moment, when one guest dared to change everything on live TV. The story begins in a seemingly familiar setting, a popular talk show, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. This show has always been associated with witty conversations, sharp humor, and a relaxed atmosphere. But that day, something different happened. Karoline Leavitt, a woman with strong opinions who isn't afraid to tackle sensitive social issues, shocked not only Stephen Colbert but also the entire audience watching on TV. It wasn't just a casual chat between two people, it became a moment of reckoning, a call to address real, important issues that many would rather ignore. Unlike most guests who come to share light-hearted stories or jokes, Karoline wasn't there to do that. She came with a clear purpose, to change the atmosphere, to make people question things they often overlook. From the moment she walked into the show, it was clear that this wouldn't be an ordinary conversation. With the social issues that were rapidly gaining traction, she wasn't hesitant to reveal truths that society didn't want to face: issues about racism, inequality, and personal rights, things many people were avoiding. Throughout the conversation, Stephen Colbert, who is famous for his wit and ability to handle any situation with ease, was faced with a challenge that he couldn't easily overcome. Karoline didn't just face his points head-on, she made him reconsider what he thought he knew. Every time Colbert tried to steer the conversation away from sensitive issues, Karoline would bring it back to something meaningful, something that couldn't be ignored. This was something that had never happened before during his years on the show, someone not just challenging him but making him pause and think deeply. One particularly noteworthy moment came when Colbert tried to inject some humor, hoping to diffuse the tension and lighten the mood. But Karoline didn't smile. She wasn't there for jokes when the issues she was raising were too serious to be treated as entertainment. She pointed out that discrimination was not a game, it was a real issue that millions of people face every day. As Colbert could only nervously laugh it off, the audience could feel the intensity in the air. To better understand who Karoline is, it's important to note her confidence and conviction in addressing difficult issues. She's not someone who backs down easily. Karoline has always been at the forefront of discussing social issues, regardless of the discomfort or criticism that might come her way. She faces problems that many shy away from, creating intense debates but also standing strong in her beliefs. She's never one to sit back or let others dominate a conversation. She knows that if she doesn't speak up, no one else will. Because of this, she made Colbert someone known for his sharp wit stop in his tracks. This isn't just about a funny moment or a clever response. It's about facing issues that have real consequences, and Karoline's voice had enough power to take the spotlight away from Colbert's usual control of the show. Her questions weren't just simple political or social inquiries, they were deep, layered, and required more than just a quick answer. They demanded thought, introspection, and, most importantly, action. Stephen Colbert, throughout the conversation, found himself in a situation where his usual charm and humor were no longer enough. A seasoned talk show host, always able to deflect, joke, and move on from any situation, was now faced with a woman who wasn't playing by those rules. She wasn't interested in easing into the conversation or in playing to the cameras. She was there to speak uncomfortable truths, and she wasn't going to let anyone ignore them. When Colbert tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, Karoline pulled it back to the heart of the matter: discrimination, injustice, and the issues that still plague society. She reminded him that these things weren't funny, they weren't entertainment, they were real-life issues that needed to be addressed. While Colbert nervously chuckled, the tension in the air was palpable. The audience felt the shift, and it wasn't just a shift in tone, but in the deeper message Karoline was delivering. This moment wasn't just an entertaining conversation on a late-night show, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that we can no longer laugh off these issues. Karoline wasn't just giving her opinions, she was raising the real-life struggles of those who have been silenced, marginalized, and oppressed. And she was doing it boldly, without hesitation. By the end of the segment, it was clear that this wouldn't be an ordinary show. Karoline had transformed the discussion from a typical celebrity interview into a deep, thought-provoking conversation that demanded more from Colbert and the audience than just laughs. It was a conversation that had to be continued not just in the studio, but in the minds of everyone who was watching. And as the cameras turned off, the lingering silence in the room spoke volumes. As the conversation between Karoline Leavitt and Stephen Colbert continued, the relationship between the two gradually evolved into a vivid reflection of the deep differences in social views. Both represented not just individual perspectives but also the wider divide between two opposing sides in a larger debate about society, ethics, and politics. While Colbert was known for his quick wit and clever handling of situations, Karoline was a woman willing to directly confront sensitive issues, unafraid to create conflict. And it was precisely this conflict that not only made their conversation so memorable but also reflected broader societal divides. Karoline's appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was not a typical guest appearance. It was an event where a young woman decided to break through expectations and transform the nature of their dialogue. She wasn't there to fill the airtime with light-hearted banter or playful stories. She came to change the atmosphere, to make viewers reconsider things they've been conditioned to overlook. From the moment she entered the stage, it was evident that this conversation would be anything but ordinary. Against the backdrop of rapidly rising social issues, Karoline wasn't hesitant to expose the truth society often ignores: racism, inequality, and personal rights that are often sidelined. Throughout the interview, Stephen Colbert, famous for his intelligence and ability to maintain control of a conversation, found himself in a position he wasn't used to. Karoline didn't just challenge his ideas, she made him question what he thought he knew. Every time Colbert tried to steer the conversation in a lighter direction, Karoline would firmly bring it back to something more substantial: issues that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't something that had happened before in his years of hosting the show, where guests typically didn't push back in such a direct way. Karoline wasn't just disagreeing with Colbert, she was making him confront the uncomfortable truths of the world. One particularly significant moment came when Colbert tried to introduce some humor, hoping to alleviate the tension and bring some levity back to the conversation. But Karoline didn't laugh. She didn't have time for jokes when the issues she was raising were too important to be trivialized. She pointed out that discrimination isn't something to be joked about, it's a real and serious issue that millions of people face every day. While Colbert attempted to deflect with a nervous smile, the audience could feel the change in the air. It was no longer about entertainment or humor, it was about something far more serious. To truly understand Karoline, we must recognize her unwavering confidence and resolve in addressing difficult issues. She isn't someone who will back down or shy away from a challenge. Karoline has always been at the forefront of advocating for social change, standing firm in her beliefs even when faced with pushback. She faces issues that others avoid, sparking heated debates but also standing strong and unyielding. She doesn't wait for others to speak for her, nor does she stand idly by while important conversations go unspoken. She knows that if she doesn't stand up, no one else will. That is why she left Colbert, a man known for his sharp humor, speechless. This moment wasn't about making a quick witty comeback or using clever remarks, it was about confronting difficult realities that have real consequences. Karoline's voice had power, enough to shift the focus of the entire conversation from the lighthearted to the profound. Her questions weren't simple political or social inquiries, they were complex, layered, and required more than just a quick, surface-level response. They demanded introspection and most crucially action. Stephen Colbert, during the conversation, found himself in a situation where his usual charisma and humor weren't enough to keep the conversation flowing in his usual manner. A seasoned host, adept at steering interviews and diffusing tension, was now in front of someone who wouldn't let him off the hook. Karoline wasn't interested in smooth talk or polite exchanges. She was there to speak the uncomfortable truths, and she wasn't going to let anyone ignore them. When Colbert tried to shift the conversation to safer ground, Karoline swiftly brought it back to the core issue: discrimination, injustice, and the systemic issues still plaguing society. She reminded him that these aren't laughing matters, they are life and death issues that must be addressed. As Colbert nervously laughed off the tension, the audience felt the shift not just in tone, but in the deeper message Karoline was sending. This wasn't just a segment for entertainment, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that these issues can't continue to be brushed aside. Karoline wasn't just offering her opinions, she was giving a voice to the people who have been silenced, to the people who have been ignored by society for far too long. And she was doing it without hesitation, without sugarcoating the truth. By the end of the segment, it was clear that this wasn't going to be a typical late-night show. Karoline had taken the conversation from a celebrity interview to something deeper, something that demanded more from Colbert and the audience than just a few laughs. It was a conversation that needed to be continued not just in the studio, but in the minds of everyone watching. And as the cameras turned off, the silence that followed spoke volumes. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Karoline Leavitt and Stephen Colbert's relationship was transforming into a vivid representation of the sharp divide in social perspectives. Both were not just individuals with differing opinions, but symbols of larger, opposing forces in a bigger societal debate about ethics, justice, and politics. While Colbert had always been known for his sharp wit and ability to handle anything thrown his way, Karoline was unafraid to face sensitive topics head-on, even if it meant creating conflict. And this conflict didn't just make the conversation memorable, it mirrored the broader issues of division within society. Karoline's appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert wasn't a typical guest appearance. It was an event where a young woman made the decision to shatter expectations and completely alter the dynamic of their conversation. She didn't come to just fill airtime with casual banter or light-hearted stories. She came with a clear purpose: to disrupt the comfort zone, to make everyone watching question the things they had been ignoring. From the moment she entered the studio, it was clear that this would be anything but a casual chat. With the rise of social issues dominating public discourse, Karoline wasn't hesitating to reveal the truths that society was too scared to confront: issues about racism, inequality, and basic human rights that were often overlooked. Throughout the interview, Stephen Colbert, famous for his intelligence and ability to steer any conversation, found himself in unfamiliar territory. Karoline didn't just disagree with him, she made him question what he thought he knew. Every time Colbert tried to steer the conversation back to safer, lighter ground, Karoline would redirect it to something more substantial, something that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't something that had happened before during his many years as a talk show host, where guests usually played along and didn't push back so aggressively. Karoline wasn't merely questioning him, she was forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truths of the world. One particularly striking moment came when Colbert attempted to lighten the mood with humor, hoping to relieve the tension and get back to his usual tone. But Karoline didn't laugh. She didn't have time for jokes when the issues she was raising were far too serious to be brushed off. She reminded him that discrimination wasn't a laughing matter, it was something that millions of people faced every day. While Colbert could only nervously chuckle, the audience could feel the palpable shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer a show about light entertainment or comedy, it was about something much deeper. To truly understand Karoline, we need to see her as someone with unwavering confidence and determination in tackling difficult issues. She's not the kind of person to back down when faced with adversity. Karoline has always been at the forefront of discussions about social change, standing her ground even when met with resistance. She faces issues that many prefer to avoid, igniting passionate debates but always standing strong in her beliefs. She doesn't wait for others to speak up, she does it herself, knowing that if she doesn't stand up, no one else will. That's why she left Colbert, someone known for his sharp wit and humor, speechless. This wasn't about making quick, clever comebacks or using humor to deflect the conversation. It was about confronting hard truths that have real-life consequences. Karoline's voice was powerful enough to shift the entire conversation, taking it from a light, casual tone to something much more profound. Her questions weren't the typical political or social queries, they were layered, complex, and demanded more than a simple, surface-level response. They demanded introspection, and most importantly, action. Throughout the conversation, Stephen Colbert found himself in a position where his usual charisma and quick thinking were no longer enough. A seasoned host, skilled at maintaining control and diffusing tension, now found himself in front of someone who wasn't going to let him get away with superficial answers. Karoline wasn't interested in easing the conversation or appeasing the audience, she was there to speak uncomfortable truths, and she wasn't going to let anyone avoid them. When Colbert attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction, Karoline quickly brought it back to the core issue: discrimination, inequality, and the systemic issues that still exist in society. She reminded him that these were not things to joke about, things that could just be brushed aside. They were real issues that affected people's lives. As Colbert nervously laughed, trying to deflect the conversation, the tension in the room grew. The audience felt the shift not just in the tone, but in the deeper message Karoline was sending. What started as an entertainment segment quickly became something more meaningful. Karoline wasn't just offering her views, she was raising the voices of those who have been ignored, those whose struggles have been silenced by society. She was calling for real change, and she wasn't going to back down. By the end of the segment, it was clear that this wouldn't just be another celebrity interview, it was a pivotal moment that had to be continued, not only in the studio but also in the minds of those watching. When the cameras stopped rolling, the silence that filled the room spoke volumes. The audience was left with something far more lasting than a few laughs. Karoline's words had planted a seed of awareness, and the conversation was far from over. The silence wasn't a negative one, it was the kind of silence that comes when people realize that they've been confronted with something that demands reflection and action. And as the credits rolled, one thing was clear: this wasn't just another late-night show segment, it was the beginning of something much bigger. As the conversation between Karoline Leavitt and Stephen Colbert continued, it became increasingly evident that the tension between them was not just an isolated moment on a talk show, it was symbolic of a larger struggle in society. Karoline was no longer simply a guest on the show, she had become a force that challenged not just Colbert, but the entire notion of how sensitive social issues were treated in mainstream media. Colbert, usually known for his sharp wit and ability to handle difficult topics with humor, found himself caught in a conversation that required more than just quick responses or clever comebacks. This conversation was no longer about entertainment, it was about real-world issues that had far-reaching consequences. While Colbert tried to keep the conversation light, using humor to soften the tension, Karoline refused to let the moment pass without addressing the underlying problems in society. She refused to let her message be reduced to just another funny moment on late-night television. Instead, she pushed back, emphasizing that issues like discrimination, racism, and gender inequality weren't things to be laughed off. These were real problems that affected real people, and they demanded attention, not just for entertainment but for change. The more Colbert tried to steer the conversation away from these issues, the more Karoline brought it back to the core topics that she was passionate about. The audience could feel the shift, and it was clear that this wasn't just a trivial debate anymore. This was a confrontation, not just between two individuals, but between two viewpoints on how we should engage with the world around us. Colbert, for all his expertise and experience in handling conversations, was in uncharted territory. For the first time, he was being forced to grapple with something deeper than the usual banter and humor that characterized his show. One of the most striking moments came when Colbert attempted to lighten the mood, trying to return to his usual mode of humor. However, Karoline didn't allow it. She didn't let him divert the conversation with jokes, because, for her, the issue was too important to be trivialized. She pointed out that issues like racism and discrimination couldn't be reduced to jokes. They were life and death matters for millions of people, and she wasn't about to let them be dismissed for the sake of entertainment. Colbert, usually quick on his feet with humor, found himself unable to deflect the gravity of the situation. It was a moment of realization: humor could no longer mask the truth. This wasn't just a discussion on television, it became a crucial moment for both Colbert and the audience. Karoline had made it clear that it was no longer enough to laugh at these issues or pretend they didn't exist. She was demanding that people take these problems seriously, that they not look away or brush them off as too difficult to discuss. This was an invitation to face reality head-on, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. What made this conversation so powerful was that Karoline wasn't just challenging Colbert, she was challenging all of us. She was asking why we continue to tolerate these injustices, why we allow them to persist in a world that claims to champion fairness and equality. And by doing so, she was pushing for real change. Colbert, though typically in control of the narrative, found himself momentarily silenced, realizing that this wasn't a conversation he could control. It was a conversation that needed to happen, regardless of how awkward or uncomfortable it might make him or anyone else feel. The intensity of this moment left a lasting impact on the audience. It wasn't just about Colbert's reaction or Karoline's forceful words, it was about how these issues reverberated in the minds of viewers, long after the show had ended. Karoline had done more than just speak her mind, she had forced everyone, including Colbert, to reconsider the way they viewed the world and their role in changing it. This was a conversation about action, not just words. Colbert's silence, rather than being a sign of defeat, became an acknowledgement that the conversation had shifted, that something had changed. In that silence, there was recognition that the issues Karoline brought up couldn't be ignored any longer. It was no longer acceptable to laugh off social injustices, to pretend that they didn't matter. Karoline had made it clear that these issues were urgent, that they were not just something to talk about when convenient but something to address now, in a real and meaningful way. As the show wound down, the weight of what had transpired on stage hung in the air. Karoline had succeeded in doing what very few guests had ever done: she had taken control of the conversation and shifted it from entertainment to something far more important. The questions she raised were not meant to be answered in sound bites or jokes, they were meant to be answered in actions. And the real change, she made clear, would come when people stopped pretending these issues didn't exist and started actively working toward solutions. In the end, the conversation between Karoline and Colbert was more than just a late-night segment. It was a turning point. It was a reminder that the world needs to take a hard look at its values and priorities. And, most importantly, it was a call to action, urging everyone, both in the studio and at home, to recognize that silence is not an option when faced with inequality. Only through action, through genuine dialogue, can change truly happen. By the time the conversation was winding down, it was clear that the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The usual light-hearted nature of the Late Show had been replaced with something far more intense. The audience, once accustomed to laughter and easy banter, now found themselves facing uncomfortable but crucial questions. Karoline Leavitt had succeeded in what few guests had ever been able to do: she had transformed the conversation from mere entertainment into a thought-provoking discussion about the pressing issues of society. This wasn't just about politics or entertainment, it was about justice, equality, and the way society addresses systemic issues that affect millions of people. As the cameras stopped rolling and the show ended, the silence in the room wasn't one of awkwardness, but one of reflection. The impact of Karoline's words had lingered. It wasn't just Colbert who had been forced to reconsider his perspective on these issues, it was the entire audience. Karoline had opened their eyes to the fact that many of the problems facing society, such as discrimination, racism, and inequality, weren't just abstract concepts or something to discuss in passing. They were issues that affected real people, people whose voices were often silenced or ignored. And she had made it clear that this silence must end. Colbert, a host known for his ability to steer any conversation with ease, had been put in a position where he had to pause and think. His usual humor and cleverness couldn't deflect Karoline's powerful words. In fact, her questions had placed him in an uncomfortable but necessary position, to face the uncomfortable truth that these social issues must be acknowledged and addressed in a real way. Colbert's usual role as the one who controlled the conversation had been disrupted. Karoline's presence had shifted the power dynamic, and it wasn't something he could easily return to his comfort zone. For Colbert, this was a moment of realization. His laughter, his quick quips, and his witty comebacks, tools he had relied on for years, could no longer serve as a defense mechanism against the pressing issues Karoline was raising. She wasn't there to be part of the usual show banter. She was there to confront the harsh realities of the world, to make Colbert and everyone watching take a hard look at the state of things. For him, this was more than just an interview, it was a lesson. The conversation couldn't just be about solving problems with humor and ease. It required a deeper engagement, a willingness to grapple with uncomfortable truths, and the recognition that it was time for change. And it wasn't just Colbert who had learned something that day. The audience, too, had been forced to confront the issues that Karoline was so passionately bringing up. They couldn't just sit back and laugh anymore. The issues of race, gender inequality, and social justice weren't things that could be brushed under the rug, and Karoline's words had made that crystal clear. The silence that followed the conversation wasn't just awkwardness, it was the silence of an audience processing everything they had just heard. The silence in the studio was palpable. It wasn't just the usual response after a segment, it was a reflection of the weight of what had just been discussed. Karoline's message had been heard loud and clear. The audience had been forced to think about the issues that are often pushed aside, issues that affect so many people in ways that aren't often seen on the surface. She had made them realize that they could no longer ignore the real, urgent problems facing society. These issues needed to be addressed not just with words but with action. And Karoline, in her straightforward, no-nonsense way, had called them to act. This wasn't just a conversation that happened on the Late Show. It was a pivotal moment, one that would stay with the audience long after the cameras stopped rolling. Karoline had made sure of that. She wasn't interested in a superficial conversation, she was interested in creating lasting change. By the end of the show, Colbert and everyone in the room knew that this was not a conversation that could be forgotten. The words Karoline had spoken had touched on deep, systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Her message was clear: the world cannot continue to look the other way when it comes to discrimination and inequality. Silence, whether from a late-night host or the audience at home, was no longer an option. When the lights dimmed and the final credits rolled, Karoline had done more than just speak out on important issues. She had sparked a necessary conversation. One that needed to be had not only in the studio but across the country, and even the world. And as people left their screens, as the applause faded, they were left with one question: what are we going to do about it? Karoline had provided the answers, but now it was up to each individual to take responsibility and act. By the time the conversation was winding down, it became apparent that the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The usual light-hearted tone of the Late Show had been replaced by something far more serious. The audience, accustomed to laughter and easy banter, now found themselves confronting uncomfortable but crucial questions. Karoline Leavitt had succeeded in doing what very few guests have been able to accomplish. She had transformed the conversation from pure entertainment into a deep, thought-provoking discussion about the urgent issues facing society. It was no longer about politics or celebrity gossip, it was about justice, equality, and the way society addresses the systemic problems that affect millions of people. As the cameras turned off and the show ended, the silence in the room wasn't one of awkwardness, but rather one of reflection. Karoline's words had left a lasting impact. It wasn't just Colbert who had been forced to reconsider his perspective on these issues, it was the entire audience. Karoline had made them realize that many of the problems society faces, racism, inequality, and discrimination, weren't abstract issues to be discussed and dismissed. These were real problems affecting real people, and she made it clear that the silence must end. Colbert, a host known for his ability to keep control of conversations, found himself in a position where he had to pause and think. His usual humor and quick wit couldn't deflect the gravity of Karoline's words. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't a conversation he could control. For the first time, Colbert was forced to confront something deeper than the usual banter and jokes that defined his show. He found himself listening not just as a host, but as a human being confronted with uncomfortable truths that demanded attention. Karoline's questions had placed Colbert in an uncomfortable but necessary position. He had to face the harsh reality that the issues Karoline was raising couldn't just be laughed off or ignored. They were issues that required serious consideration and action. It wasn't enough to simply talk about these problems, they needed to be addressed in a real, meaningful way. Colbert, for all his skill in managing a talk show, now had to accept that the conversation needed to go beyond the surface. Karoline had changed the rules of engagement, and the audience could feel the shift. The moment wasn't just a turning point for Colbert, it was a wake-up call for the entire audience. They were forced to confront the questions Karoline raised. Why do we continue to tolerate injustice? Why do we turn a blind eye to issues like racism and inequality that affect so many people in our society? Karoline wasn't just challenging Colbert, she was challenging all of us. She was asking why we continue to ignore the issues that make the world an unfair place. The weight of this realization wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Karoline had pushed the conversation beyond entertainment into the realm of real change. She had shown that these issues needed to be addressed with the urgency and seriousness they deserved. And through her boldness, she had made it clear that we, as a society, can no longer ignore these problems. We can no longer pretend that they don't affect us all. As the silence settled, Colbert found himself reflecting on what had just occurred. It wasn't just the usual follow-up to a show where guests speak and then go home. This was a conversation that had challenged him, and through him, the entire audience, to reconsider their approach to these social issues. He understood that, as someone with a platform, he had a responsibility to take these discussions seriously and use his influence to bring about change. He couldn't just laugh off the tough questions, he had to act on them. The silence in the studio wasn't awkward, it was a silence filled with introspection. The message Karoline brought had resonated with everyone, and the change had already started to happen. The audience, and Colbert himself, knew that the conversation couldn't end here. It had to continue beyond the studio, in their homes, workplaces, and communities. The silence was a call to action, a reminder that these issues cannot continue to be ignored. When the show ended, it wasn't just the typical end of show credits. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the conversation about racism, discrimination, and inequality had been opened up in a new way. Karoline had made sure of that. She didn't just raise awareness, she forced everyone involved to take responsibility for making a difference. It was now up to the audience and Colbert to ask themselves, what comes next? How do we, as individuals and as a society, take action? Karoline had provided the answers, but it was clear that the real work had just begun. By the time the show wrapped up, it was evident that the atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. The usual light-hearted tone of the Late Show had been replaced with something far deeper and more serious. The audience, once accustomed to laughing and enjoying easy banter, now found themselves confronted with uncomfortable but necessary questions. Karoline Leavitt had achieved something very few guests could. She had transformed the conversation from mere entertainment into a thought-provoking discussion about real, urgent societal issues. This was no longer about celebrity gossip or political games. It was about justice, equality, and the systemic problems that affect millions of people. As the cameras turned off and the show concluded, the silence in the room wasn't awkward, it was reflective. Karoline's words had left a lasting impact. It wasn't just Colbert who had been forced to reconsider his position on these issues, but the entire audience. Karoline had made them realize that many of the issues plaguing society, racism, inequality, and discrimination, were not abstract concepts to be debated and forgotten. They were real problems that affect real people, and she had made it clear that ignoring them was no longer an option. Colbert, known for his ability to steer conversations and maintain control of the narrative, found himself in a position where he had to pause and truly listen. His usual quick wit and humor couldn't deflect the gravity of Karoline's words. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just another typical late-night segment, it was a conversation that required deep reflection and serious consideration. Colbert, a host who had been in charge of countless interviews, was now forced to confront uncomfortable truths, not as a host but as a human being, having to reckon with the weight of the issues Karoline was raising. Karoline's questions had placed Colbert in an uncomfortable, yet necessary, position. He had to face the fact that the issues she was discussing couldn't be laughed off or ignored. They were important, life-changing issues that required more than just talk, they required action. Colbert, for all his experience in leading a show, had to acknowledge that this conversation was beyond just entertainment. Karoline had broken the mold and forced him, and the audience, to engage with the issues in a real, meaningful way. One of the most powerful moments was when Colbert attempted to use humor to lighten the mood, trying to return to his usual routine. However, Karoline didn't allow that. She didn't let him deflect the conversation with jokes because the issues at hand were far too important. She pointed out that racism and discrimination couldn't be reduced to humor. They were real, tangible issues that affected people's lives, and they needed to be treated as such. Colbert, who typically had the upper hand with humor, found himself unable to dismiss the gravity of the conversation. It was a moment of realization for him: humor could no longer mask the truth. This wasn't just a conversation between two individuals on television, it became a moment of awakening for everyone involved. Karoline had made it clear that these issues needed to be addressed seriously. No longer could society laugh off racism, inequality, and discrimination as jokes or fleeting concerns. These were real problems, and they demanded the attention they had long been denied. Through her words, Karoline had made it impossible for Colbert and the audience to ignore the painful reality of these issues. What had begun as a typical late-night interview had turned into a pivotal moment. Karoline had succeeded not only in confronting Colbert but also in confronting the entire audience with the uncomfortable truths about their society. Colbert and the viewers were forced to ask themselves, how long can we ignore these issues? When will we act? The silence that followed wasn't just an uncomfortable pause, it was a call to action. The realization was clear: ignoring these issues wasn't an option anymore. Colbert, though still recovering from the intensity of the conversation, had come to understand that the platform he had was meant for more than just entertainment. He had a responsibility to use his voice and influence to spark change. And this responsibility wasn't just his, it was shared by everyone who had watched the conversation unfold. The challenge was no longer just about discussing social issues, it was about doing something to change them. As the credits rolled and the lights dimmed, Karoline had accomplished what many before her had failed to do. She had taken a simple late-night talk show segment and turned it into a catalyst for deeper thinking, introspection, and action. She didn't just raise awareness about the issues of discrimination, inequality, and racism, she demanded change. And that change couldn't be achieved through silence. It would only come when society as a whole decided to stop ignoring the truth and started taking action. The conversation didn't end with the final credits. It was only just beginning. Karoline had sparked a conversation that needed to continue, one that would challenge Colbert, the audience, and society to ask themselves, what are we going to do about this? And as people reflected on what had just occurred, they knew that the next steps toward real change were up to them. Karoline had provided the answers, but now it was time for everyone else to step up and act.